Welcome to English 430 and 560. These are the podcasts for Shakespeare's drama, produced by and starring Dr. Bill Dines.
The tragedy of Othello, the Moor of Venice, is an interesting departure for Shakespeare, as it's the only one of the four great tragedies to concentrate on a protagonist of less than noble birth. Aristotle had argued, of course, that true tragedy involved persons of significance, people, quote, above the common level, end quote. Now, it's not clear whether Aristotle's Poetics was available to Shakespeare, but for the most part, Shakespeare adhered to this prescription. Other than Othello, his only other tragic hero who is not a member of the nobility or a great military figure is Romeo, and you'll notice that we're really not concentrating much on that play this semester. To be sure, Othello is not a common, everyday kind of guy. You don't become the leader of the Venetian military by being ordinary. But he is not a prince or a king, and what's happening to him is not really affecting the fates of nations, and that makes him a little bit easier for us to connect with, I think. It's that sense of connection or identification that's so important here. And the first thing to emphasize is that Shakespeare does not want to make that identification easy or uncomplicated. Even the title of the play draws our attention to Othello's alienation, which, by the way, is the title of an excellent article on the subject by Edward Berry. It's available on our website, and I highly recommend it. The title emphasizes Othello's double status. He's both a Moor, which English men and women of the day would have associated with North Africa and the Near East, but he's also of Venice. Now that duality is going to be crucial to Othello's experience in the play and to our response to it. So a quick survey of the way in which duality functions in the play is going to be instructive. Along with the question of Othello's citizenship, we might add the issue of his religion. He's clearly Christian throughout the play, and he never makes any reference to any sort of conversion experience. For example, notice the way he intervenes to break up the fight between Cassio and Montano in Act 2, Scene 3. He says, quote, "Are we turned Turks, and to ourselves do that which heaven hath forbid the Ottomites? For Christian shame, put by this barbarous brawl." End quote. His Moorishness, then, appears to be simply an ethnic rather than a religious identification. But I suspect that we know Shakespeare too well by now to imagine that such an identification is going to be simple. Remember that Shakespeare was living in a country that perceived itself to be a Protestant bulwark against an international Catholic scourge. And yet many of the citizens of that country would have remembered being Catholic, or that their parents had been, under Queen Mary. The tension between political, ethnic, and religious identification, then, is absolutely crucial to making sense of this play. And of course, the problem of identification doesn't stop with faith, politics, or ethnic background, does it? Othello is one of Shakespeare's plays that has actually become more relevant to American audiences over the passage of time. If you're curious, I would add Troilus and Cressida, King Lear, and The Tempest to that list. I don't mean to imply, of course, that Shakespeare was prescient, or that he was writing about issues that really only became important later and weren't important in his own day. But early modern England was beginning to bump up against a much richer variety of cultures and persons than it had in its medieval past. And the consequent experiences of mistrust, exploitation, conflict, and discovery are all processes that we're still involved with today. What fascinated Shakespeare, I think, was the negotiation involved, often unconscious, often uneasy, when we meet the other with a capital O. For the Jacobean English in 1604, that confrontation was often perceived in terms of either religion or nationality. For 21st century Americans, religion is returning as a significant testing ground, but race remains the most powerful and potentially explosive site. Interestingly, it's not clear whether Shakespeare and the newly renamed Kingsmen would have presented their Othello as a black-skinned African or a dusky Arabian. Most Londoners would not have had much experience with either group, and it seems to me that while it would be interesting from a historical or academic point of view to find out just what Richard Burbage looked like when he first appeared as Othello. That really doesn't get us much closer to the heart of the play. What matters is that Othello's physical appearance marked him as immediately different from anyone else on the stage. For modern Americans, at least, that difference is more historically and socially important when presented in terms of black and white, and that's why most performances cast African American actors as Othello. Edward Berry goes into this in a lot more detail than I can or than I should here, and again I strongly recommend that article, Othello's Alienation. As an introduction to the play, it's probably enough for me to ask you just to watch the way Othello's ideas about himself change while he's in Cyprus. Compare, for example, what Othello tells Iago about his past in Act 1, Scene 2, with the story he relates to the Duke in the following scene, and then compare when he's defending his marriage to Desdemona, and then compare all of that with his bitter and painful attack on Desdemona in Act 3, Scene 3, when he states that her name, quote, is now begrimed and black as mine own face, end quote. Watch the way Othello uses imagery of light and dark, black and white, and how that usage changes over the course of the play. This can give us a helpful understanding of what's going on in his mind. If we don't respect Othello even at his worst, then the ending of the play won't affect us the way it really should. We're talking about duality, and of course that means we have to talk about Iago. He swears by Janus, the two-faced Roman god, and it may be tempting to dismiss him as simply a lying hypocrite, appearing one way when he's around Othello, another way when he's not. Yet Iago has a different face for everybody that he meets. He's probably the best actor we meet this semester. Consider, too, his metaphor about the body and the will. The context is his conversation with Rodrigo in Act 1, Scene 3. Iago asserts that, quote, our bodies are our gardens, to the which our wills are gardeners. We have reason to cool our raging motions, our carnal stings, our unbitted lusts, end quote. Iago is insisting that we have the capacity to control our passions with reason, and he's implying that everything he does, therefore, is deliberate and calculated. In the context of Shakespeare's career, we have to recognize the parallel here with Prince Hal, Hamlet, even with Rosalind, all of whom struggle to assert reason over passion. In the context of the play, this sends us back to the search for motive. Why does Iago do what he does? Well, as you read the play, you may want to keep track of the motives that he offers, when he offers them, and to whom he explains them. Even more interestingly, perhaps, when does he stop talking about motive? I cannot finish this introduction without a couple of words at least about Desdemona. I'll admit that some of my students have disliked her. She falls too easily for Othello. She takes too long to realize what's happening to her husband. She doesn't defend herself adequately once he's succumbed to jealousy. But for me, I think she's one of Shakespeare's most vibrant and interesting female characters. Certainly there isn't another woman in the tragedies who can stand up next to her. Cordelia and King Lear may come close, I suppose, and we'll talk about her more when we reach that play. But neither Gertrude nor Ophelia deserve to be in the same room with her. And Lady Macbeth, if you've had the pleasure of meeting her, isn't exactly someone I'd want to get to know better. We first meet Desdemona when she's summoned before the Duke, her father, and the other senators of Venice in Act 1, Scene 3, and she's forced to answer for what she's done. The moment is reminiscent of Hermia before Theseus and Aegeus in A Midsummer Night's Dream, though of course we're poignantly aware of the fact that that play was a comedy, this one's a tragedy. There's a dignity and a self-possession about Desdemona here that should instantly win our respect. And this sets up our sympathy for her as Othello begins to lose himself to Iago. Just as with her husband, if we don't respect Desdemona, then the climax of the play simply doesn't work. I have two more things I want to say about the duality in this play, and I'm sure we'll develop others as we talk about it in class. The duality of the play's setting will be obvious to you. You're already used to Shakespeare's court versus green world structure from plays like A Midsummer Night's Dream and As You Like It. But again, this is a tragic world, not a comic one. And the movement from Venice to Cyprus, from civic rigidity to rural disorder, does not have the same kind of liberating effect here. Keep an eye also on the role of time in the play. I will have occasion to ask you just how much time passes during the course of the play's action. I think you'll find that the answer to that question to be an important one as we go about trying to make sense of what becomes of Mr. and Mrs. Othello.